The witch's curse, they said it was just a story. Something to scare kids on Halloween night. You know how these small towns are. Everyone's got their little legends, their weird rituals. This one, though, had a certain kind of edge to it. The kind that made you uneasy, even when you didn't believe it. Not really. No one talked about her anymore. The witch. Her name had been swallowed by time, erased by the generations who wanted to forget her altogether. But the house stood there still, rotting, leaning, and yet untouched by the world around it. The children would laugh and dare each other to run up and touch the door, but none of them actually knocked. None of them dared to, until tonight. There were 6 of us, standing in the woods just behind the crumbling house, the air thick with the scent of wet leaves and smoke from distant bonfires. We weren't kids anymore, not really. But the town didn't offer much for a thrill, and Halloween was as good an excuse as any to push boundaries. It was his idea, the quiet one in our group. He always had that look in his eye, like he knew something the rest of us didn't. A strange glint, a hint of mischief. He was the one who suggested the dare. Knock on the door, ask for a wish. Simple, right? They say she grants it, but there's a catch. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial. We all knew the catch. Everyone did. You ask for your wish, and it comes true, but then she takes something from you. No one ever said what that something was. No one who asked for a wish ever talked about it afterward. The stories said it wasn't worth the asking. But he was convinced, said it was just an old tale, some kind of superstition. We were too old to believe in that kind of thing. Too old to be scared. Right. The rest of us laughed it off, of course. Called him crazy. But somehow we found ourselves standing there in the thick black night, staring at the house like moths circling a flame. The moon was heavy, its light filtering through the bare branches like skeletal fingers reaching for us. Go on then, someone said. You're the one with the wish, right? He didn't even hesitate. Walked straight up to the door like he was daring it to stop him. The rest of us stayed back, half hiding behind the trees, half too curious to look away. The house loomed above him, its dark windows watching, waiting. The air seemed to change, growing colder, thicker with something we couldn't name. He knocked. Once. Twice. And then, the door creaked open on its own, slowly, like the house had been waiting for him. The sound was low, groaning, like bones grinding against each other. My stomach twisted, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. He stepped inside. We waited. Minutes passed, and then finally, he came back out looking the same. Calm, even. He walked back to us, grinning, like it was the easiest thing in the world. The rest of us stared at him wide-eyed, waiting for the catch. Well? One of us asked, breaking the thick silence. He shrugged. I made the wish, simple as that. It didn't feel simple. There was something off, something lurking in the air around us. But no one said it. We all just stood there, waiting for him to say what he wished for. He didn't. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The air felt wrong, thicker, like something unseen had pressed in closer to us, waiting. We tried to act normal, laughing and shoving each other, pretending we weren't still thinking about that door, about the witch who was supposed to be behind it. And then it happened. The wish. His wish. It came true. Not in some dramatic, obvious way. No, it was subtle at first. Just a change in his luck. Little things going his way, winning bets, acing tests he barely studied for, getting out of trouble with teachers. But soon the changes became more unsettling. He started knowing things, personal things, secrets no one should have known. Dark things about us, about our families. We tried to laugh it off at first, but the more it happened, the more unnerved we became. There was something different about him now. His smile was a little too wide, his eyes a little too dark. And that feeling, the one that had settled over us since that night, kept growing. It was in the air around him, thick and suffocating, like something was watching, something that wasn't him. By the end of the week, we couldn't ignore it anymore. He was changing. His laugh had taken on an edge. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like he wasn't entirely in control. And then there were the things he started saying. I didn't ask for this, he told me one night, his voice low, his eyes wide and frantic. I didn't ask for this. What did you ask for? I demanded. He never got the chance to answer. That night we all heard it, the knocking. Soft at first, then louder, more insistent. A relentless pounding at our doors. When I opened mine, no one was there. But the air outside, it was thick with the smell of something rotten. like something had crawled out of the grave and was standing just out of sight. And I wasn't the only one. Each of us heard it. Each of us saw the same thing. A shadow, flickering just at the edge of our vision, disappearing as soon as we turned our heads. But we knew what it was. We knew who it was. The witch. She had come to collect. The knocking didn't stop. It came every night after that, pounding against the walls of our minds even when it wasn't at our doors. Some of us tried to ignore it, pretend like we hadn't heard a thing, like everything was still normal. But it wasn't. And deep down we all knew it. Things had gotten worse, way worse. He had gotten worse. There was no denying it now. He wouldn't show up to school for days, disappearing without explanation. And when he did come around, it was like looking at a stranger. His skin was pale, almost gray, with deep circles under his eyes. His movements were jerky, like he was being pulled along by invisible strings, and his voice was different. Raspy, hollow, as if something was speaking through him. The rest of us tried to distance ourselves, to stay away from him. It felt like the curse was crawling into our lives, threading its dark tendrils through our everyday routines, waiting to strike. Then came the first disappearance. It was one of us. One of the 6 who had stood in the woods that night laughing at the dare, thinking it was all a joke. He didn't show up to school the next day, but no one thought much of it at first. Maybe he was sick, maybe he just needed a day off. But by the second day, whispers started spreading around town. His parents hadn't heard from him, his bed hadn't been slept in. The third day they found his shoes by the creek, mud caked on the soles, but no one found him. And that's when the panic set in. One of us was gone. I remember sitting in my room that night, the clock ticking away the seconds, the darkness pressing against the window. I kept the lights on, but it didn't help. It didn't stop the feeling that something was watching me from just beyond the glass. My hands were shaking, a cold sweat creeping down my spine as I tried not to think about that door, that damn door, and the shadow that stood just behind it. A sudden noise snapped me out of my thoughts, a rustling outside, too close for comfort. My heart pounded against my chest, each beat a hammer to my ribs as I slowly approached the window, peeking out through the curtain. The yard was empty. But then there it was again. A knock. Soft, slow, deliberate. I froze, eyes locked on the door as the knocks continued, one after another, growing louder with each strike. My breath hitched in my throat as I stumbled back from the window, my mind racing with every horrible thing that could be waiting on the other side of that door. I didn't open it. I couldn't. Instead, I stood there in the middle of the room, staring at the door as if it might burst open at any second. The knocking finally stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. But I knew, whatever was out there hadn't left. It was waiting. The next day, we found out another one of us was gone. His parents found his room torn apart, the window flung wide open, curtains fluttering in the morning breeze. They said there were no signs of a struggle, no footprints, no clue where he could have gone. Just gone, like he'd been plucked out of existence. And that's when we realized. It was happening again. The witch was claiming her due. Panic gripped us all. No one said it out loud, but we knew. We knew that it was coming for the rest of us. The wish had been made, and now the price had to be paid. We tried to talk to him, the one who knocked on the door, the one who made the wish. We demanded to know what he asked for, what he had done to bring this curse upon us. But he wouldn't speak. He just stood there, staring at us with those empty eyes, a twisted smile tugging at the corner of his lips. It was like looking into a void. By the 4th night, the knocking had become relentless. Each of us heard it, pounding against our doors, our windows, echoing inside our heads. No one was safe. No one could escape it. That's when we decided we had to go back. Back to the house, back to the witch. Maybe if we returned, we could undo what had been done. Maybe we could stop it before it claimed another one of us. We gathered at the edge of the woods, the same group of us. Well, what was left of us? 4 now. Just 4. The house loomed in the distance, black against the night sky, twisted and rotten. Its windows were dark, but I could feel eyes watching us from within, waiting. "Are you sure about this?" one of us asked, his voice trembling. None of us were sure, but we didn't have a choice. We made our way through the trees, each step heavier than the last, the air growing colder as we neared the house. The silence was oppressive, thick with the weight of what was to come. And then we reached it. The door stood before us, just as it had that night. Old, weathered, yet somehow menacing. We hesitated, the cold seeping into our bones as we exchanged nervous glances. He was the first to step forward, the one who had started it all. His face was pale, eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. Or something worse. Without a word, he raised his hand and knocked. The sound echoed through the night, deeper, louder than it should have been. We all held our breath, waiting for the door to open, but it didn't. Instead, the ground beneath us began to tremble, a low rumble spreading through the earth. My stomach dropped, and I looked around frantically, expecting the worst. And then the door creaked open. Slowly, agonizingly slow. Inside, there was nothing but darkness, an endless, yawning abyss. He stepped inside first, disappearing into the black. One by one, we followed, our breaths shallow, our hearts pounding. The house swallowed us whole, and then we heard the door slam shut behind us. Locked in. No turning back now. The door slammed behind us with a deafening crack, and the darkness closed in like a noose tightening around our throats. I reached out blindly, my fingers brushing the rough walls of the narrow hallway we had stumbled into. The air inside the house was different, thick and stifling, with a damp, moldy scent that made my skin crawl. No one spoke. We were too terrified, our breaths coming in ragged gasps as we strained to see anything in the oppressive blackness. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was deeper than that. It felt like the very air had been sucked out of the room, leaving behind a void, a pit that threatened to swallow us whole. I heard a creak, the sound of footsteps behind us, but when I turned, there was nothing. Just shadows that seemed to writhe and shift in the corners of my vision. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure everyone could hear it, like a drum beat counting down to something terrible. "Keep moving," someone whispered, though I couldn't tell who. The voice was shaky, almost desperate. We inched forward, one step at a time, deeper into the house. The floorboards groaned under our weight, each step louder than the last, like the house was alive, protesting our presence. The hallway seemed endless, stretching far beyond what should have been possible. With every step, the walls seemed to close in, the ceiling pressing down until I felt like I couldn't breathe. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. A soft, wet drip. 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 My stomach turned as the smell hit me, coppery, metallic. I knew that smell. Blood. I stopped dead in my tracks, my mouth dry, fear gripping my chest like a vice. The others must have noticed too, because the shuffling stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. And then, without warning, a scream, loud, piercing, and raw, shattered the stillness. It wasn't from one of us. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The scream came again, closer this time, echoing through the narrow hallway, followed by a wet, tearing sound that made my stomach lurch. Someone, or something, was being torn apart. We backed up, panicked whispers breaking out among us. But before we could even think of turning around, he appeared, the one who made the wish. He stepped out of the shadows ahead, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes wide with terror. But there was something else, his hands. They were soaked in blood, dripping onto the floorboards with that sickening drip. Drip. "What the hell happened?" I shouted, but my voice came out as a hoarse whisper, strangled by fear. He just stared at me, his lips trembling. Then he started laughing, a high, brittle sound that sent chills down my spine. "I didn't ask for this," he muttered, almost to himself. "I didn't ask for this." Before we could react, the lights flickered, just once, a weak, sickly glow that illuminated the hallway for the briefest of moments. And that's when we saw it. There, standing behind him in the dim light, was a figure, a woman, or at least what used to be a woman. Her skin was gray and stretched tight over her bones, her eyes black and empty, like twin pits of endless darkness. Her mouth was twisted into a cruel, mocking grin, blood dripping from her fingertips. The witch. My throat tightened, and I staggered back, instinctively pressing myself against the wall as my heart hammered in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I knew was that we had to get out, now, but it was too late. She reached out with one skeletal hand, her fingers curling around his neck with a slow, deliberate motion. His laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a choking gasp as she lifted him off the ground effortlessly, her grin widening. We watched in horror as his body convulsed, his limbs twitching and flailing as she squeezed tighter and tighter. Blood poured from his mouth, his eyes bulging in their sockets, until finally, with a sickening snap, his head lolled to the side, his neck broken. She dropped him like a rag doll, his body hitting the floor with a heavy thud. And then, she turned toward us. For a moment we were frozen, paralyzed by the terror that gripped us. Her black eyes locked onto mine, and I felt something cold and sharp twist inside me, as if she were reaching into my very soul. Without thinking, I bolted. I didn't wait for the others. I didn't even know if they were still behind me. I just ran, my feet pounding against the floor as I tore down the endless hallway, the walls blurring around me. The sound of my heartbeat roared in my ears, drowning out everything else. I could hear her behind me. That horrible wet drip. Drip, drip of blood following me through the house. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found a door. A heavy wooden door that looked out of place in the decaying house. Without hesitation, I flung it open and stumbled through, slamming it shut behind me. I was in a small, dimly lit room. There was no furniture, no windows, just four walls and the door I had just come through. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest heaving as I leaned against the wall, trying to calm the terror that had taken hold of me. But then I noticed something. I wasn't alone. There, in the far corner of the room, was a figure, curled up on the floor, shaking violently. One of us. He was covered in blood, his clothes soaked, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were wide and wild, darting around the room like a trapped animal. He looked up at me, his lips trembling. We can't leave," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "She won't let us leave." I swallowed hard, my heart still racing. "There has to be a way out. There has to be." His eyes darted toward the door. "She's waiting." Before I could respond, the door behind me creaked open. I didn't dare turn around. I didn't have to. I knew she was standing there watching, waiting for us to run, because the chase wasn't over. Not yet. The door creaked behind me, slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. My breath hitched, my pulse roaring in my ears. I could feel her standing there watching us. The witch. She wasn't in any rush. Why would she be? We were trapped, caged like rats in a maze of her own design. I looked at the boy curled up on the floor. His eyes were wide, wild with terror, but something in me snapped. Maybe it was the realization that running had gotten us nowhere. Maybe it was the fear that if I kept running, she'd get me next. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something, or maybe, just maybe, it was something deeper. A spark of defiance that I hadn't known I had in me. She wouldn't take us. Not like this. I knelt beside him, my voice steady but low. "We're getting out of here. We're going to beat her." He shook his head violently, his voice a broken whisper. "There's no way out. There never was. The door—" I cut him off. "That's not true. There is a way." I didn't know where that certainty came from. I didn't even know if it was true. But deep down, in the pit of my stomach, I felt something. A flicker of hope, faint but undeniable. We had started this together, and if there was any chance to break the curse, we had to end it together. I stood up, turning to face the door, my heart pounding as I forced myself to confront the figure standing in the doorway. The witch. She was as terrifying as before, her skin gray and withered, her eyes black as the void. But this time I looked beyond the horror. I saw something else there, something ancient but not unbeatable. I stepped toward her, my legs trembling, but I held my ground. "You made a deal," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "He made a wish, but you didn't tell us the whole truth. There's always a way out of a curse. Always." Her grin widened, sharp and twisted. The air around her grew colder, and I could feel a chill seep into my bones. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. "You've taken enough. We've lost too much, but you can't have us. Not now. Not ever." Her eyes flashed, and for a moment the room seemed to shift. The walls warped, the ceiling cracked, and the very air felt like it was pressing down on us. But I saw it. The flicker of hesitation, the briefest moment where her grip on this house, on us, faltered. That's when I knew. There was a way out. She wasn't invincible. I took another step toward her. "We're not afraid of you anymore." And then, something incredible happened. The boy behind me, his trembling, stopped. He stood up, shaky at first, but then stronger, as if my words had sparked something in him too. He took a step toward me, standing by my side. We were still scared, of course we were. But we weren't powerless. Not anymore. The witch's grin faltered, her eyes narrowing. The room seemed to tremble again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was something else. The house groaned, the walls creaked, and the oppressive darkness that had surrounded us began to lift, like a thick fog slowly retreating. "You don't control us," I said, my voice steady. "Not anymore?" The air shifted again, the darkness peeling away as light, real, warm light, began to filter into the room. The witch let out a hiss, a sound that rattled the walls, but she didn't move. She couldn't, because we weren't afraid anymore. Suddenly, I felt the floor beneath us give way, not collapsing, but softening, like the ground itself was letting us go. The door behind the witch burst open, not with a screech of terror, but with a rush of fresh air. Real air. The scent of pine trees and damp earth filled my lungs. The night outside was no longer dark and suffocating. It was alive, full of life, full of possibility. I grabbed the boy's arm. "Come on." We ran past her, through the doorway, and into the cool night air. Behind us, the house groaned one final time, the door slamming shut with a deafening bang. But the witch didn't follow. We kept running, our feet pounding the earth, the wind whipping through our hair as we made our way back to the clearing where this nightmare had begun. My heart was still racing, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the rush of being free, of knowing we had escaped. When we reached the edge of the woods, we stopped, gasping for breath, our chests heaving with relief. I looked at the boy beside me. His face was pale, but he was alive. We both were. We had made it out. For the first time in what felt like forever, I looked up at the sky. The moon hung there, bright and full, casting its silver light across the forest. There were no more shadows, no more darkness creeping in from the edges. The curse was broken. I turned to him, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "We did it." He nodded, his own smile faint but real. "We're alive." And in that moment, I knew that whatever had held us in that house, whatever curse had bound us to the witch's game, was gone. For the first time, the town's legend had been defeated. We had faced the witch, stared into the abyss, and come out the other side. Together we had won. The night was still and calm now, and as we walked back toward town, I couldn't help but feel a lightness in my chest. We were safe. The others, they would be remembered, but we had broken the cycle. The witch would never claim another soul. We were free, and for the first time in what felt like forever, everything was going to be okay.